The massive space station hung in orbit around Glacius 7, a world so cold that even the sun looked pale and distant. Inside the station, 12 young beings from different worlds sat in a waiting room that buzzed with nervous energy. Each one represented their species at the Galactic Academy of Sciences, and today they would face the most feared challenge in the Academy's history. Keth shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his orange skin already showing signs of stress. He came from Aridus, where the temperature never dropped below 50 degrees and the sand was always warm under his feet. The very thought of the ice world below made his internal temperature regulation system work overtime. He looked at his environmental suit hanging on the wall, a massive thing with heating coils running through every part of it. The suit alone weighed more than he did. Next to him sat Lyra, her blue-green skin glistening with moisture from the small humidifier attached to her chair. Her people lived in the warm depths of Thalas's oceans, where the water was always the perfect temperature and pressure. Her suit was more like a mobile aquarium, complete with water recycling systems and temperature controls that would keep her comfortable in any environment. She had practiced in the suit for months, but moving on land still felt awkward and slow. Brix stood by the window, his stone-like body clicking softly as he moved. The Protheans were beings of living rock who absorbed heat from their volcanic world. Without constant warmth, his joints would seize up and his body would crack like a statue left in the cold. His suit was the most complex of all, with thermal generators that could produce heat equivalent to a small lava flow. Even with all that technology, he knew the cold would be his greatest enemy. The other students represented equally specialized species. There was Nyx from the cloud cities of Arios, who had never felt solid ground under his feet. Zara from the crystal caves of Lumina, whose people saw in spectrums of light that didn't exist on most worlds. Each student had evolved in perfect conditions for their world, and each would need advanced technology just to survive on GLACIUS-7. Then there was Tom. He sat quietly in the corner, looking completely ordinary. His skin was pale, his hair was brown, and he wore simple clothes that looked like they came from any basic supply store. While the other students checked and double-checked their environmental systems, Tom just sat there reading a book. His gear consisted of a jacket, boots, gloves, and a small backpack. That was it. The other students kept looking at him with confusion and concern. Keth finally spoke up, his voice carrying the heat-shimmer accent of his people. "Human Tom, where is your environmental suit?" Tom looked up from his book and smiled. "Don't need one." Lyra's gill slits fluttered with distress. "But the surface temperature is minus 40 degrees. The wind carries ice crystals that can cut through metal. How will you survive without protection?" Tom shrugged. "I'll figure it out." Brix's stone face showed what might have been worry. "My thermal readings show that an unprotected human would last maybe 10 minutes in those conditions. Perhaps there has been a mistake with your equipment delivery?" "No mistake," Tom said, closing his book. "This is all I need." The Academy supervisor, a tall creature with too many eyes and skin like polished metal, entered the room. Its voice echoed from speakers built into the walls. "Students, the frozen labyrinth awaits. This challenge has been attempted by over 300 beings in the past 50 years. Only 12 have completed it successfully. The maze spans 10 kilometers of shifting ice formations, temperature drops that can reach minus 60 degrees, and environmental hazards that will test every aspect of your survival training." The supervisor's many eyes focused on each student in turn. "Your suits have been tested and approved. Your backup systems are functioning. Your emergency beacons are active. You will enter the maze at different points and navigate to the center, where you will find the completion marker. The student who reaches the center first will receive the Academy's highest honor." Tom raised his hand. "What if someone gets lost or their equipment fails?" "Rescue teams will extract any student who activates their emergency beacon. However, such activation results in immediate failure of the challenge." The supervisor's eyes fixed on Tom. "Are you certain you wish to proceed with such minimal equipment?" "I'm certain." The other students exchanged glances. They had all heard stories about humans, mostly about their strange custom of visiting dangerous places for fun. But this was different. This was a challenge that had killed students before, even with the best technology available. The supervisor led them to the transport bay, where a shuttle waited to take them to the surface. Through the windows, they could see Glacier 7 below. A world of white and gray where storms raged constantly and the landscape changed with every wind. As they descended through the atmosphere, the temperature readings on the shuttle's displays kept dropping. -20, -30, -40. The other students began activating their suits, running through final system checks. Heating elements came online, power cells showed full charge, and backup systems stood ready. Tom just put on his jacket. The shuttle landed on a flat area of ice that had been cleared by the Academy's preparation teams. The moment the doors opened, the cold hit them like a physical blow. Even inside their environmental suits, the other students could feel the brutal temperature trying to find its way through their protection. Tom stepped out of the shuttle and took a deep breath. The air was so cold it made his lungs ache, but he didn't seem bothered by it. He pulled his jacket tighter and walked toward his assigned entry point. The maze rose before them like a wall of blue-white ice, twisted and carved by wind into impossible shapes. The passages were narrow, the walls were smooth as glass, and somewhere in the distance they could hear the sound of shifting ice as the maze changed its configuration. Keth looked at his suit's display, which showed dozens of warning lights about the extreme conditions. Lyra's aquatic suit was already working hard to maintain proper temperature and humidity. Brix's thermal generators were running at 50% capacity just to keep him from freezing in place. Tom walked to his entry point, a narrow gap between two walls of ice that seemed to glow with their own cold light. He turned back to look at the other students, all of them struggling with their equipment and the harsh environment. "See you at the center," he said, and stepped into the maze. The other students watched him disappear into the ice corridors, certain they would never see him alive again. The human had no heating system, no backup power, no emergency shelter. He was walking into a death trap with nothing but confidence and a jacket that looked like it came from a discount store. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would change the galaxy's understanding of what it meant to be human. The ice maze was worse than any of the students had imagined. The walls rose 20 meters high on all sides, carved by wind and time into smooth surfaces that reflected sound in strange ways. Every footstep echoed, every breath created clouds of vapor that hung in the still air. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees since they entered, and the maze seemed to suck the heat from everything it touched. Keth moved slowly through his assigned passage, his environmental suit humming, with the effort of keeping him alive. The heating coils that ran through his suit glowed softly, creating a warm bubble around his body. But even with all that technology, he could feel the cold trying to find its way inside. His suit's computer kept announcing warnings about power consumption and external temperature readings. The desert dweller had never experienced anything like this. On Eritis, the coldest night was still warmer than most world's summer days. His people had evolved to radiate heat, not conserve it. Every step forward felt like walking deeper into death itself. The ice under his feet was so slick that he had to move carefully, and his suit's weight made balance difficult. Lyra was having her own problems. Her aquatic suit was essentially a mobile water tank, keeping her gills moist and her body at the perfect temperature. But the extreme cold was making her suit work overtime, and she could hear the recycling pumps struggling to maintain proper conditions. The water that kept her alive was threatening to freeze inside her own life support system. Her passage was narrow and winding, with walls that seemed to press in from all sides. The Thalison had to move sideways in some places, her bulky suit scraping against the ice walls. She had trained for this, but training in a controlled environment was nothing like the real thing. The maze felt alive, hostile, like it was actively trying to kill her. Brix faced the greatest challenge of all. His stone body was already starting to stiffen as the cold seeped into his joints. The thermal generators in his suit were working at maximum capacity, but it wasn't enough. He could feel himself slowing down, his movements becoming more and more mechanical. If his internal temperature dropped much further, he would lock up completely and become a statue of living rock. The Pyrothean's passage was the most treacherous, with sections where the floor had fallen away to reveal deep crevasses. He had to move carefully, testing each step before putting his full weight down. His suit's weight made jumping impossible, so he had to find ways around every obstacle. The thermal generators were draining his power cells faster than expected, and he knew he didn't have much time. Tom walked through his passage like he was taking a stroll through a park. The cold air felt sharp in his lungs, but it was a familiar sensation. He had grown up in places where winter meant survival, where going outside without proper preparation could kill you. But this wasn't survival to him, it was just another cold day. His passage was filled with obstacles that would have stopped the other students cold. There were sections where the walls were covered in ice so slick it was like polished glass. There were narrow gaps where he had to squeeze through, spaces barely wide enough for his body. There were areas where the floor was nothing but loose ice that shifted and cracked under his weight. Tom moved through all of it with an ease that would have amazed the other students. When he came to the glass-smooth ice sections, he didn't fight for grip like the others would have. Instead, he used the slickness to his advantage, controlling his slides and using momentum to carry him forward. His boots had treads designed for ice, and his body knew how to move on unstable surfaces. The monitoring drones that followed each student were recording everything, and the Academy scientists watching from orbit were starting to notice something unusual. While the other students struggled with every step, their suits working overtime to keep them alive, Tom seemed to be getting more comfortable as the temperature dropped. His movements were fluid and natural, like he belonged in this environment. When he encountered a section where the passage split into 3 different paths, he didn't hesitate or consult any instruments. He touched the walls of each passage, feeling for air currents and temperature differences, then chose the middle path without a second thought. The other students were still struggling with the basic challenge of staying alive. Keth's suit was consuming power at an alarming rate, and he had to stop every few minutes to let his heating system catch up. Lyra was making progress, but slowly, and her suit's water recycling system was starting to show strain. Brix was moving like a robot, his joints stiff and his reactions slow. Tom reached the first major obstacle in his path, a section where the floor was covered in ice so thin it looked like it might break at any moment. Below the ice, he could see dark water moving in currents that suggested the pool was deeper than it looked. The other students would have had to find a way around, or risk their heavy suits breaking through the ice. Tom studied the ice for a moment, then stepped onto it carefully. He spread his weight evenly, moving with the same careful balance he had learned skating on frozen ponds as a child. The ice held, and he crossed the entire section without breaking through. On the other side, he found a passage that the other students would never have been able to reach. The maze seemed to respond to his confidence. Passages that had been hidden became visible. Paths that looked impossible became manageable. Tom wasn't fighting the environment like the others, he was working with it. He read the ice like a book, understanding which surfaces were safe and which were treacherous. Behind him, the other students were falling further and further behind. Keth had gotten turned around in a section where the passages all looked the same, and his suit's navigation system was having trouble with the ice interfering with its sensors. Lyra had found a passage that looked promising, but it led to a dead end, and now she had to backtrack while her suit's power levels continued to drop. Brix was in the worst shape. His thermal generators were running at 100%, but it still wasn't enough. His joints were seizing up, and he was starting to move like a statue coming to life. Each step took enormous effort, and he knew he was running out of time. Tom, meanwhile, had found the rhythm of the maze. He moved like water, flowing around obstacles instead of fighting them. When he came to a wall that was too high to climb, he found handholds in the ice that others would have missed. When he encountered a passage that seemed to lead nowhere, he discovered hidden openings that connected to other parts of the maze. The Academy scientists were starting to realize they were witnessing something unprecedented. The human wasn't just surviving in conditions that should have killed him, he was thriving. His body temperature was stable, his movements were confident, and he seemed to be reading the maze like he had built it himself. Tom reached a section where the passage opened into a wider area, and he could see other passages leading off in different directions. This was clearly a major junction in the maze, and he knew the other students would have to pass through here eventually. He sat down on a block of ice and waited, not because he was tired, but because he wanted to see how the others were doing. The cold didn't bother him. If anything, it seemed to sharpen his senses and clear his mind. He could hear the other students struggling in their passages, their equipment humming and whining with the effort of keeping them alive. He could hear the maze itself, the way the ice shifted and settled, the way the wind moved through the passages. Tom smiled and stood up. The center of the maze was still ahead, and he had a feeling the real challenge was just beginning. The maze grew more dangerous as the students pushed deeper into its heart. The temperature had dropped to -50 degrees, and the walls were now coated with a layer of ice, so thick it looked like crystal. Every surface was slippery, every step was treacherous, and the cold was becoming a living thing that tried to steal the warmth from their bodies. Keth was in serious trouble. His environmental suit was consuming power at twice the expected rate, and the heating coils were struggling to keep up with the brutal cold. His internal temperature was dropping despite all the technology wrapped around him. The suit's computer kept flashing warnings about power levels and system strain. He had to stop every few meters to let his heating system catch up, and even then he could feel the cold seeping through his protection. The Desert Dweller's passage had led him to a section where the walls were covered in ice formations that looked like frozen waterfalls. The beauty was stunning but deadly. The ice was so smooth that his heavy suit couldn't find purchase on any surface. He had fallen twice already, and each time it took enormous effort to get back on his feet. His suit's weight, which was supposed to provide stability, was now working against him. Lyra's aquatic suit was facing a different kind of crisis. The water recycling system was working so hard to prevent freezing that it was overheating other components. Her suit's computer was having to choose between keeping her water liquid and maintaining proper temperature control. The Thalassan could feel the conflict in her suit's systems, and she knew she was running out of time. Her passage had become a tunnel of ice, so narrow that her bulky suit barely fit through. She had to move sideways, scraping against the walls with every step. The friction was damaging her suit's outer layer, and she could hear small alarms going off as sensors detected microfractures in her protection. One serious breach and the cold would rush in, freezing her water supply and killing her within minutes. Brix was barely moving now. His stone body had stiffened to the point where each step was a major effort. The thermal generators in his suit were running at maximum output, but it wasn't enough. The Pyrothean's joints were seizing up, and his movements were becoming more and more mechanical. He knew that if he stopped moving, he would freeze in place like a statue. His passage had brought him to a section where the floor was covered in loose ice chunks that shifted and moved under his weight. His suit was too heavy for the unstable surface, and he kept breaking through into hidden gaps. Each time he had to struggle to pull himself out, draining more power from his thermal systems. He was caught in a cycle where movement was necessary to stay alive, but movement was using up the power he needed to survive. The other students were facing similar problems. Their advanced technology was failing them when they needed it most. The extreme conditions of the maze were pushing their environmental suits beyond their design limits. Systems were overheating, power cells were draining, and backup systems were kicking in all across the maze. Tom, meanwhile, was moving through the maze like he owned it. The dropping temperature seemed to have no effect on him at all. If anything, he appeared to be getting more comfortable as the conditions became more extreme. His movements were smooth and confident, and he seemed to know exactly where he was going even when the passages twisted and turned in impossible directions. The human had reached a section that would have stopped any of the other students cold. The passage ended in a wall of ice that stretched up beyond sight, smooth as glass and impossible to climb. There was no way around, no alternate path, no obvious solution. The other students would have had to turn back and find another route. Losing precious time and power, Tom looked at the wall for a moment, then did something that would have amazed the watching scientists. He began to climb. Not with equipment or tools, but with his bare hands. His fingers found tiny imperfections in the ice, cracks and ridges that were invisible to the naked eye but provided just enough grip for someone who knew how to use them. He climbed like a spider, his body pressed against the ice wall, his movements careful and controlled. His boots found purchase on surfaces that looked completely smooth, and his hands gripped ice that should have been too slippery to hold. He moved up the wall steadily, never hesitating, never slipping until he reached the top and pulled himself. Over the edge, the Academy scientists watching from orbit were stunned. The human had just climbed a wall that their instruments said was unclimbable. They began pulling up data on human physiology, trying to understand what they were seeing. What they found changed everything they thought they knew about the species. From Earth, humans had evolved on a world of constant change, where the environment shifted from hot to cold, wet to dry, safe to dangerous with the changing seasons. Their bodies were designed for adaptation, not specialization. They could survive in a wider range of conditions than almost any other known species. And they did it without advanced technology. Tom's skin was designed to conserve heat in cold conditions and release it in warm ones. His muscles generated heat through movement, and his body knew how to adjust its metabolism to match the environment. His hands and feet had evolved to grip surfaces that other species would find impossible to hold. His eyes could adjust to different light conditions, and his brain could process environmental information in ways that seemed almost supernatural. The human was using abilities that his species had developed over millions of years of evolution. He wasn't fighting the environment like the others, he was working with it. The ice wasn't his enemy, it was just another surface to navigate. The cold wasn't trying to kill him, it was just another condition to adapt to. Tom reached a section of the maze that was even more treacherous than what he had already passed. The passage was filled with ice formations that looked like frozen lightning, all sharp edges and unstable surfaces. The floor was covered in ice so thin it was transparent, and below it he could see cracks that went down into darkness. He moved through the section like he was dancing. His feet found the solid spots automatically, his hands used the ice formations for balance, and his body flowed around obstacles that would have trapped the other students. He wasn't thinking about his movements, he was just responding to the environment with instincts that had been bred into his species over countless generations. Behind him, the other students were falling further and further behind. Keth's suit was now running on backup power, and he knew he had maybe an hour before his heating system failed completely. Lara's water recycling system was throwing error messages, and she could feel the temperature of her suit's internal water dropping degree by degree. Bricks had stopped moving entirely, his stone body, locked in place by the extreme cold. Tom reached another major junction in the maze and stopped to listen. He could hear the other students struggling in their passages, their equipment failing, their movements becoming more and more desperate. He realized that they weren't just competing against each other anymore. They were fighting for their lives. The human made a decision that would have surprised everyone watching. Instead of continuing toward the center of the maze, he began to backtrack. He moved quickly but carefully, retracing his steps through passages he had already mastered. He wasn't heading for the finish line anymore. He was heading for the other students. The Academy scientists couldn't understand what they were seeing. The human was giving up his lead, abandoning his chance at victory for no apparent reason. They didn't realize that Tom had heard something in the sounds coming from the other passages. Something that told him the other students were in real danger. Tom moved through the maze with new purpose. He wasn't just navigating anymore, he was hunting. But he wasn't hunting for victory, he was hunting for his fellow students. The cold that was trying to kill them was just another obstacle to overcome, and overcoming obstacles was what humans did best. The maze had become a death trap. What started as a challenge had turned into a survival nightmare as the temperature plummeted to minus 60 degrees. The walls were now covered in ice so thick they looked like they were made of solid crystal. and every breath created clouds of vapor that froze and fell like snow. Keth was the first to realize he was dying. His environmental suit's heating system had finally given up, overwhelmed by the extreme cold and the constant demand for power. The heating coils that had kept him alive were now cold metal pressing against his body, and he could feel his internal temperature dropping fast. His movements became sluggish, his thoughts fuzzy, and his vision started to blur. The desert dweller tried to activate his emergency beacon, but his fingers were too stiff to work the controls properly. His suit's computer was flashing red warnings, but he could barely read them through the frost that was forming on his visor. He stumbled and fell, his heavy suit crashing against the ice walls, and he didn't have the strength to get back up. Keth lay on the ice, feeling the cold seeping through his failed suit, and realized he was about to die in the most horrible way possible for someone from his species. The irony wasn't lost on him that he who had spent his life surrounded by heat and sand would freeze to death in a maze of ice. His breathing became shallow, and he could feel his consciousness starting to fade. Lyra's situation was just as desperate. Her aquatic suit had finally lost the battle against the cold, and the water that kept her alive was starting to freeze inside her life support system. She could feel ice crystals forming in her gills, and her suit's recycling pumps were making grinding noises that meant they were about to fail completely. The Thalassa was trapped in a narrow passage where her bulky suit had gotten wedged between the ice walls. She had been trying to squeeze through when the suit's outer layer had frozen solid, locking her in place like a fish in ice. Her emergency beacon was working, but she knew rescue teams couldn't reach her in this maze. She was going to die slowly. Frozen in place, unable to move or breathe properly, Brix had become exactly what he feared most, a statue of living rock. His joints had seized up completely, and his stone body was locked in a walking position that he couldn't change. The thermal generators in his suit had drained his power cells and then died, leaving him with no source of heat at all. The cold was working its way into his very core, and he could feel cracks starting to form in his stone skin. The Pyrothean stood motionless in a section of the maze where the passage opened into a wider area. He looked like a sculpture, beautiful and terrible, frozen in time. His consciousness was still there, trapped inside a body that wouldn't respond to his commands. He could hear the other students struggling in nearby passages, but he couldn't move or speak or help them in any way. The Academy scientists watching from orbit were starting to panic. 3 of their students were clearly in life-threatening situations, and the rescue teams couldn't reach them until the current storm passed. The maze was too dangerous for aircraft, and ground teams would take hours to navigate to the students' positions. They were watching their students die, and there was nothing they could do about it. Then they saw something that changed everything. Tom had reached Keth's position, moving through passages that should have been impossible to navigate. The human appeared on their screens like a ghost, sliding through sections of the maze that their instruments said were impassable. He moved with purpose and speed, but also with the careful control of someone who understood the environment completely. Tom found Keth lying motionless on the ice, his suit dark and lifeless. The desert dweller was unconscious, his body temperature dropping toward fatal levels. Tom knelt beside him and began working with an efficiency that amazed the watching scientists. He didn't have any medical equipment or heating devices, but he had something better. He had knowledge. The human began by checking Keth's vital signs, using techniques that seemed primitive but were actually highly effective. He could tell from the color of Keth's skin and the pattern of his breathing that the alien was in severe hypothermia but still alive. Tom began the process of warming him, using his own body heat and techniques that had been passed down through generations of humans who lived in cold climates. Tom gathered loose ice and began building a shelter around Keth, using the ice itself as insulation. He worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced skill as he created a windbreak and then a small enclosed space. The scientists couldn't understand what he was doing until they realized he was creating a microenvironment where his body heat could warm the air around both of them. The human pulled Keth close to him, sharing his body heat directly. He began massaging the alien's limbs, working circulation back into extremities that had started to freeze. He talked to Keth constantly, even though the alien was unconscious, because he knew that sometimes the sound of a voice could help someone fight their way back from the edge of death. Slowly, incredibly, Keth began to respond. His breathing became stronger, his skin color improved, and eventually his eyes opened. The desert dweller looked up at Tom with confusion and gratitude, not understanding how he was alive or why the human was there instead of winning the challenge, but Tom wasn't finished. He helped Keth to his feet and began moving toward Lara's position, supporting the weakened alien as they navigated through passages that were becoming more and more treacherous. The human seemed to know exactly where to go, moving through the maze like he had a map in his head. They found Lyra trapped in the narrow passage, her suit frozen solid and her breathing shallow. Tom studied the situation for a moment, then began working on her suit with techniques that seemed impossibly crude but were actually incredibly effective. He used friction to generate heat, warming the suit's joints until they became mobile. Again, he worked the ice out of her life support system, clearing passages that had frozen shut. It took time, but eventually Lyra's suit began functioning again. The Thalassan gasped as warm water began flowing through her gills and her suit's recycling system came back online. She looked at Tom with amazement, not understanding how he had saved her life with nothing but his bare hands and basic knowledge. Tom helped both aliens to the shelter he had built, where they huddled together sharing warmth while he went to find the others. One by one, he located the stranded students and brought them back to safety. He found bricks frozen in place and spent hours working warmth back into the Pyrothean's joints until he could move again. He found Nyx trapped in a section where the passage had collapsed, and he cleared the debris with nothing but determination and simple tools. Each rescue was different, but they all had one thing in common. Tom didn't use advanced technology or complicated procedures. He used knowledge that seemed basic but was actually incredibly sophisticated. Techniques that had been developed by humans over thousands of years of surviving in hostile environments. The Academy scientists couldn't believe what they were seeing. The human had turned a disaster into a rescue mission, saving lives that their technology couldn't reach. He had done it without any of the equipment they thought was essential, using nothing but his body, his mind, and knowledge that they were only beginning to understand. Tom brought all the students together in his improvised shelter, where they waited for the storm to pass and rescue teams to arrive. The cold that had nearly killed them was now just an uncomfortable but manageable condition. The human had created a small pocket of safety in the middle of a death trap, and he had done it with methods that seemed like magic to the watching scientists. The students looked at Tom with new respect and deep gratitude. They had all heard the stories about humans and their strange abilities, but they had never seen anything like this. The human had given up his chance at victory to save their lives, and he had done it with a skill that none of them could have imagined. As they waited for rescue, Tom sat quietly, looking completely comfortable in conditions that had nearly killed everyone else. The other students began to realize that they had been competing against something they didn't understand, something that made humanity unique in the galaxy. The rescue teams arrived expecting to find a disaster. Their instruments had shown multiple system failures, emergency situations, and life-threatening conditions throughout the maze. They came prepared for the worst with medical equipment, emergency heating systems, and body recovery gear. What they found instead changed everything they thought they knew about survival, technology, and the human species. All 12 students were alive and in relatively good condition, huddled together in a shelter that had been built from nothing but ice, snow, and salvaged materials. The shelter was a masterpiece of primitive engineering, using basic physics and environmental knowledge to create a warm, safe space in the middle of a frozen death trap. The rescue teams had to study the structure for several minutes before they understood how it worked. The human had used the ice itself as insulation, creating multiple layers that trapped warm air while blocking the wind. He had salvaged heating elements from the failed environmental suits and used them to create small heat sources that warmed the air without wasting power. He had even created a ventilation system that prevented carbon dioxide buildup while maintaining temperature control. But the real miracle was the students themselves. Keth was conscious and talking, despite the fact that his environmental suit had failed completely hours ago. Lyra was breathing normally, even though her aquatic suit had frozen solid. Brix was moving freely, his stone joints working smoothly. Despite the extreme cold that should have locked him in place permanently, the rescue team leader, a being with multiple arms and sensor arrays built into his body, ran scan after scan but couldn't understand what he was seeing. According to every calculation, every model, every piece of scientific knowledge they possessed, most of these students should have been dead. The conditions in the maze were beyond the survival limits of their species, even with the best technology available. How is this possible? The team leader asked Tom, gesturing at the shelter and the living students. Our computers show that survival in these conditions should be impossible without advanced environmental protection. Tom looked around at the other students who were all listening carefully to his answer. They had been wondering the same thing, trying to understand how the human had saved them when their technology had failed. I grew up in a place called Canada, Tom said simply. Winter temperatures there regularly drop below -30 degrees. I learned to ski before I could walk properly, played hockey on frozen ponds, and spent most of my childhood outdoors in weather that would probably kill most species in this galaxy. The rescue team leader's sensors focused on Tom with new interest. But the conditions here are far more extreme than anything on your homeworld. The temperature dropped to -60 degrees, the wind carried ice particles that can cut through metal, and the maze itself was designed to be a death trap. Tom shrugged. It was cold, sure, but I've been in worse storms. The maze was tricky, but it followed patterns that made sense once you understood them. And as for the temperature, well, that's just winter weather where I come from. The Academy. Scientists who had been monitoring the challenge from orbit were now studying every piece of data they had collected. They pulled up files on Earth's climate, human evolution, and the species' survival capabilities. What they found was revolutionary. Humans had evolved on a world where the environment changed constantly. Ice ages lasted thousands of years, followed by warming periods that melted glaciers and raised sea levels. Humans had survived through all of it, adapting to conditions that would have driven other species to extinction. They hadn't done it with technology, they had done it with intelligence, adaptability, and an incredible ability to work with their environment instead of fighting against it. The human body was designed for survival in ways that the Academy scientists had never imagined. Human skin could conserve heat in cold conditions and release it in warm ones. Human muscles generated heat through movement, and the brain could adjust the body's metabolism to match environmental conditions. Human hands and feet had evolved to grip surfaces that other species couldn't hold, and human eyes could adapt to light conditions that would blind other beings. But more than that, humans had developed knowledge systems that were passed down through generations. They knew how to build shelters from natural materials, how to create heat without technology, how to find food and water in hostile environments. They had techniques for treating injuries and illnesses that didn't require advanced medical equipment. They had survival skills that were so basic they seemed primitive but were actually incredibly sophisticated. You see, Tom explained too. The fascinated scientists, everyone else brought machines to adapt to the environment. But humans are the machine that adapts to the environment. We don't just survive winter, we learn to love it. The Academy supervisor, who had been observing the rescue operation, stepped forward with obvious amazement. You gave up your chance at victory to save the other students. You could have won the challenge easily, but instead you chose to help them. Why? Tom looked at the other students, who were all watching him with expressions of gratitude and respect. Because that's what humans do. We don't leave people behind. We don't let others die when we can save them. Winning a challenge isn't worth someone's life. The supervisor's many eyes focused on Tom with new understanding. The challenge was designed to test individual survival skills and competitive spirit. You have shown us something we never expected to see, cooperation and sacrifice in the face of extreme adversity. Keth, who had been quiet since the rescue, finally spoke up. Tom, I don't understand. How did you know how to save us? How did you know how to build that shelter, how to warm us up, how to fix our equipment? Tom smiled. Basic survival training. Every human kid learns this stuff. How to stay warm in cold weather, how to build a fire, how to treat hypothermia, how to find shelter. It's not advanced knowledge, it's just common sense where I come from. The other students exchanged glances. What Tom called common sense was advanced survival technique to them. What he considered basic knowledge was beyond the capabilities of their most sophisticated technology. Lyra spoke up, her voice filled with wonder. On my world, we have perfect conditions all the time. The temperature never changes, the pressure is always ideal, and we have technology to control everything. We never had to learn to adapt because we never had to. Bricks nodded his stone head. Slowly, my people live in volcanic regions where the heat is constant. We absorb energy from lava flows and thermal vents. We have never experienced cold like this, never had to learn to survive without external heat sources. The Academy scientists were beginning to understand something fundamental about human evolution and survival. Other species had evolved in stable environments where they could specialize and perfect their adaptation to specific conditions. Humans had evolved in an environment of constant change, where survival meant being able to adapt to anything. The rescue operation continued. But now it was more like a research expedition. Scientists from across the galaxy began studying the humans' techniques, trying to understand how such simple methods could be so effective. They analyzed the shelter, studied the rescue procedures, and interviewed Tom about his knowledge and training. The results were revolutionary. The Academy realized that they had been thinking about survival all wrong. They had assumed that advanced technology was the key to surviving in hostile environments. But Tom had shown them that knowledge and adaptability were far more important. Within weeks, the Academy had established a new department focused on studying human survival techniques. They began developing training programs based on Tom's methods, teaching students how to work with their environment instead of fighting against it. They created courses in basic survival skills, environmental adaptation, and primitive technology. The Frozen Labyrinth Challenge was retired, not because it was too dangerous, but because it was too easy for humans. The Academy realized that what they had considered an ultimate test of survival was just a moderately challenging winter day for someone from Earth. Tom returned to his studies, but he was no longer just another student. He had become a teacher, sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of humans who had learned to survive in hostile environments. His techniques spread throughout the galaxy, saving lives and changing the way entire species thought about survival. The motto carved above the entrance to the Academy's new survival training center read simply, "When technology fails, humanity endures." It was a reminder that sometimes the most advanced solution was also the most simple, and that the greatest technology was the ability to adapt and overcome.